Hey guys, tonight we begin with a small village. Not the dramatic kind, with dragons flying overhead or knights clanking around in shiny armor. Just a regular medieval village. Muddy, slightly smelly, quiet in that soft countryside way. So dim the lights a little. Let your shoulders drop. Imagine the air is cool and gray with early morning mist. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster is trying very hard to feel important. If you enjoy calm stories like this, you're welcome to subscribe. It helps keep these quiet histories alive. But for now, just settle in. There is no rush. The year is somewhere in the 1300s. No one in the village is exactly sure which year, because calendars are not really a daily concern. The crops are the calendar. The church bells are the clock, and the sun, as always, is in charge. The village wakes before dawn because it has to. There is no sleeping in. The sun rises, and so does everyone else. A thin ribbon of smoke begins to curl from the thatched roofs as hearth fires are coaxed back to life. The houses are small. Most are made of timber frames filled with wattle and daub, which is a charming phrase that really means sticks and mud. The roofs are thick with straw, which looks picturesque from a distance and occasionally catches fire in a very unpicturesque way. Inside one of these houses, a peasant family stirs. The father, who is perhaps 35 but looks closer to 50 because medieval life is not a skincare routine, sits up from a mattress stuffed with straw. He shares the house with his wife, several children, and possibly a grandparent who has stubbornly refused to die. Privacy is not a concept here. The single-room house contains beds, a table, stools, tools, and usually a chicken or two who wandered in and decided they live here now. The air inside smells of smoke, wool, and humanity. It is not terrible, it is just constant. The fire in the hearth never truly goes out. It is the heart of the home, the kitchen, the heater, and the light source. Breakfast is not exciting. It is usually bread. Dark, heavy bread made from rye or barley, sometimes dipped in weak ale because the water supply is questionable. Ale for breakfast sounds rebellious, but this ale is so low in alcohol that even the children drink it. It is safer than the water and tastes faintly like disappointment. Outside, the village itself is small, perhaps 20 to 40 houses clustered together around a church. The church is the tallest building and the most impressive. Its stone walls suggest permanence in a world where most things rot or burn. The priest, who can read and write, and therefore might as well be a wizard, lives nearby in a slightly better house. He has books, actual books, handwritten, precious. The villagers regard him with respect and mild suspicion. Fields stretch beyond the houses in long open strips. The open field system means that land is divided into narrow strips farmed by different families. No neat little fences, no charming hedgerows just yet, just wide expanses of crops that everyone depends on and worries about constantly. Wheat, barley, oats, maybe peas and beans, cabbages if they're feeling adventurous. The father steps outside into the cool morning. The ground is damp. There are no paved roads, just packed earth paths that turn into enthusiastic mud whenever it rains, which is often. He joins other men walking toward the fields. They carry simple tools, wooden plows tipped with iron, hoes, sickles. Their work is slow and repetitive. There is no dramatic music, just the sound of wind and distant animals. Medieval farming is not romantic, it is relentless. In spring there is plowing and sowing. In summer, weeding and worrying. In autumn, harvesting with desperate urgency before the weather changes its mind. In winter, repairing tools and trying not to starve. The entire village economy rests on whether the harvest behaves. Back in the house, the wife is already busy. She manages the domestic universe, which is larger than it sounds. She bakes bread, brews ale, tends a small kitchen garden, cares for children, spins wool into thread, and possibly helps in the fields during busy seasons. Medieval women are not idle decorative figures. They are essential to survival. She may also keep a few chickens or a pig. The pig is important. The pig is future bacon, and that is a serious matter. Children are not tucked away in nurseries with handcrafted toys. They are small co-workers. By the age of 7 or 8, they are expected to help. They gather firewood, fetch water from the village well, scare birds away from crops, and learn skills by watching adults. Education in the modern sense is rare. Most villagers will never learn to read, but they know the land, they know seasons, they know how to tell if a cow is unwell just by looking at it. Let's drift gently through the village as the morning brightens. There is the blacksmith's forge near the center. The blacksmith is one of the most important people here. He makes and repairs tools, horseshoes, nails, and occasionally weapons if someone has ambitions. His work is loud compared to the rest of the village. The rhythmic clanging of hammer on metal rings out, steady, and strangely comforting. He is stronger than most and slightly soot-covered at all times. Children stare at him like he is performing magic, which in a way he is. Nearby, there may be a mill if the village is fortunate enough to sit by a stream. The miller grinds grain into flour. He is viewed with a curious mix of necessity and distrust, because he controls the grinding of grain, and grain is life. The villagers pay him with a portion of their flour. Some suspect he takes a little extra. Of course he does. He owns the mill. Power comes in many forms, and sometimes it smells like flour dust. The social structure of the village is simple but firm. Most people are peasants, and many are serfs. This means they are legally bound to the land owned by a lord. The lord might live in a manor house nearby, not a grand castle with soaring towers, just a larger house with fewer chickens indoors. The lord rarely plows anything himself. He collects rents or labor instead. In exchange, he offers protection. Protection from what? Mostly from other lords who would very much like to collect those rents themselves. The manor court meets occasionally. Villagers gather while disputes are settled. Maybe someone's cow wandered into someone else's strip of land. Maybe someone failed to complete required labor days. The penalties are usually fines, paid in grain or coins if anyone happens to have coins. Coins are not common in daily peasant life. Most exchange is local and practical. As the sun climbs higher, the fields hum with effort. The work is steady. Bodies bend and straighten. Time moves slowly, marked only by the position of the sun and the distant tolling of the church bell. The bell regulates life. It calls for prayer. It signals noon. It may even warn of danger, though that is less common and far less welcome. Food at midday is simple. Bread again, maybe cheese if the cows have been generous, perhaps a bit of salted fish if trade routes have cooperated. Meat is rare for ordinary villagers. It appears mostly on feast days. The pig, remember, is future bacon, not current bacon. Illness is an accepted companion. People fall sick often. There are herbs and charms and the occasional traveling healer who promises much and delivers very little. The priest prays, the family waits. Sometimes the sick recover, sometimes they do not. Life expectancy is not high, though if someone survives childhood, they might live into their 50s, which in this context feels ancient. Yet, for all its hardships, village life is not constant misery. There are rhythms and routines that bring a kind of stability. Evenings are quieter. After long hours in the fields, villagers return home as the sky softens into pink and gold. Animals are brought in or secured. Doors are barred not against frequent invaders, but against wandering livestock and the occasional wolf. Inside the house, the hearth glows again. Supper is thicker stew if ingredients allow. Pottage is the usual meal, a slow-cooked mixture of grains and vegetables simmered together. It can be reheated day after day with new bits added. It is practical and dependable. No one writes poetry about pottage, but it keeps people alive. As darkness falls, there are no electric lights to banish it. Candles are expensive. Most light comes from the fire. The family gathers close. Someone may tell stories. Not grand epics every night, just familiar stories passed down through generations. Stories of saints, of local legends, of that one time old Thomas claimed he saw a ghost near the well, which was probably just mist, but let him have his moment. The village quiets early. Sleep comes quickly when your day begins before sunrise and involves manual labor. The house grows still, except for the crackling fire and soft breathing. Outside, the fields rest under the moonlight. And so ends one ordinary day. Not heroic, not dramatic, just steady, predictable, balanced on the thin edge between enough and not enough. Tomorrow will look very much the same, and in that sameness there is a strange kind of comfort. We will stay here a little longer, because the medieval village has many small corners left to explore, and we have plenty of quiet time. The next morning arrives in exactly the same way. Soft gray light, a rooster who believes he personally invented dawn, a thin chill in the air that seeps through the cracks in timber walls. No one checks a clock, no one hits snooze. The sun rises, and that is that. The village stirs again, because routine is survival. There is something deeply calming about how predictable it all is. Predictable, of course, unless the weather decides to be dramatic. And weather, in the Middle Ages, is the closest thing peasants have to a supervillain. Let's ease back into the fields. Today is plowing day. The heavy wooden plow waits at the edge of a strip of land. It is not elegant. It is sturdy in a slightly lopsided way. An ox, broad and patient, is harnessed at the front. Oxen are the tractors of the medieval world. They move slowly, breathe heavily, and do not complain, which already makes them superior to many medieval lords. The farmer guides the plow through the soil. It is hard work. The earth resists. The plow catches on stones. Hands blister. Shoulders ache. This goes on for hours. There is no playlist in the background, just wind, birds, and the steady sound of effort. Farming is a gamble every year. Too much rain and the crops rot. Too little rain and they shrivel. A late frost can undo months of labor in one cruel morning. There are no insurance policies. There is only prayer and persistence. The village follows the three-field system, which sounds impressive and almost scientific. One field is planted in autumn with winter crops, another in spring with different grains or legumes. The third is left fallow to recover. This rotation helps the soil regain strength. Medieval villagers may not have modern chemistry, but they understand, in a practical way, that land needs rest, much like the villagers themselves, though they get considerably less of it. In spring, sowing seeds is done with careful gestures. The farmer scatters them by hand in wide arcs. It looks almost artistic. Each seed is a tiny hope, and also a tiny worry. Birds watch closely. Birds are opportunists. Let's drift back toward the village center. The women are at the well now, drawing water in wooden buckets. The well is more than a water source. It is a social center. News travels here. Quiet complaints are shared. Rumors bloom gently. No one is in a rush. They speak in low tones about whose cow is sick, whose daughter might be promised in marriage, and whether the harvest looks promising this year. Marriage in the village is practical. Romantic poetry is not a priority. Families arrange matches based on land, labor, and survival. Love may come later, or it may not, but companionship, shared responsibility, and more hands to work the fields are what truly matter. A young couple might marry in their late teens or early 20s. The ceremony takes place in the church. The priest recites Latin phrases that few fully understand, though everyone nods respectfully. Afterward, there is modest celebration. Bread, ale, perhaps a bit of roasted meat if times are good. Music might come from a simple fiddle or pipe. It is cheerful, but never extravagant. Children arrive frequently. Contraception is not a structured concept. Some children survive, some do not. This reality is woven quietly into life. Grief exists, but it is folded into routine. There is work to do. There is always work to do. Now let's wander toward the manor house. It sits slightly elevated, as if it would prefer not to be too closely associated with the mud below. The lord of the manor oversees the land. He may not be especially wealthy by royal standards, but in the village he is the central authority. He collects rents, often in the form of grain, eggs, or labor days. A peasant might owe several days a week working the lord's own fields. The manor's house has multiple rooms, actual separate spaces, a luxury. There may be glass in the windows, or at least shutters that close properly. Tapestries hang on walls to keep out drafts and to suggest sophistication. The lord and his family eat better food, more meat, white bread from finer flour, wine if trade routes allow it. And yet, even here, life is not entirely glamorous. The manor can be cold. Hygiene standards are universal in their medieval modesty. Fleas do not respect social class. The lord may wear finer clothes, but he still depends on the harvest just as much as the peasants. If crops fail, his income shrinks. His obligations to higher nobles remain. Feudalism is a ladder of mutual dependence and occasional resentment. Taxes exist in many forms. Beyond rent to the lord, there is the tithe to the church, typically 1/10 of produce. The church receives grain, livestock, or whatever the land provides. This supports the priest and the wider religious structure. It also reinforces the understanding that earthly life is temporary and eternal salvation is the real goal. Conveniently, this perspective makes muddy daily labor feel slightly more meaningful. Religious life shapes the rhythm of the village deeply. Sundays are for church. Holy days are scattered throughout the year, offering small breaks from work. These feast days are cherished. They bring color to an otherwise brown and green existence. On feast days, villagers might wear their best clothes, which means slightly less patched clothes. The church interior is dim and cool. Candles flicker. The priest speaks. The villagers kneel. They confess sins that are usually minor and practical. Perhaps someone muttered something unkind. Perhaps someone worked on a holy day. Perhaps someone took a little extra flour at the mill. Of course they did. The calendar is dotted with saints' days, harvest festivals, and Christmas. Christmas in a medieval village is quieter than our modern version. It is more about shared meals and church services than elaborate gifts. There are no blinking lights, just evergreen branches, candles, and communal warmth. Now, as the sun lowers again, let's talk about clothing. Peasant clothing is simple: wool tunics, linen undergarments, cloaks for cold weather. Colors are muted, mostly browns, grays, and faded greens. Dyes are expensive. Bright red or blue is a statement reserved for the wealthy. Shoes are leather and often patched repeatedly. They are valuable and treated carefully. Laundry is a task that requires hauling water and scrubbing fabric with ash or soap made from animal fat. It is labor-intensive. Clean clothes are a small victory. Hygiene, despite popular myth, is not entirely absent. People do wash. Rivers and streams provide opportunities for bathing, though perhaps not daily. Bathhouses exist in some towns. In villages, bathing is simpler and less frequent, but not unheard of. Cleanliness is appreciated, even if it does not meet modern expectations. As the sun lowers again, animals must be managed. Chickens are gathered, cows are milked, pigs are fed scraps. Animals are wealth. Losing one can be devastating. A cow represents milk, cheese, butter.
A pig represents winter survival. Even a few chickens mean eggs and occasional meat. Let's gently touch on trade. Most villages are largely self-sufficient, but not entirely isolated. Peddlers sometimes pass through bringing small goods, needles, salt, bits of cloth. Salt is especially valuable. It preserves food and enhances flavor, which medieval diets desperately need. A villager might trade surplus grain or eggs for these small luxuries. Larger markets are found in nearby towns. Once a week or so, some villagers travel there. The journey might take hours on foot. The town feels bustling and almost overwhelming compared to the quiet village. There are more people, more noise, more smells. The market stalls overflow with goods. Spices, if one is very fortunate, dried fish, tools, cloth. It's a glimpse of a wider world. But most villagers rarely travel far. Their lives unfold within a few miles of where they were born. The horizon is both literal and social. Generations may live and die without venturing beyond neighboring villages. As night settles once more, we return to the hearth. The family eats pottage again. It tastes much like yesterday's pottage, because it is, in fact, yesterday's pottage with additions. This continuity is almost philosophical. The stew evolves gently, as does life. Stories are shared again, sometimes about distant kings and queens, grand figures whose lives seem impossibly removed from muddy boots and cracked hands. The villagers might hear news of wars or royal marriages months after they happen. It feels abstract. The king exists somewhere out there, beyond the fields. Important, yes, but distant. As night settles once more, the rooster will announce himself as if history depends on it, and the village will arise.
The year turns slowly in a medieval village. Not with fireworks, not with countdowns, just with the quiet shift of wind and soil and sky. Winter arrives without asking permission. The fields go pale and stiff. The mornings are darker. The smoke from the cottages hangs low and heavy in the cold air. Winter is the hardest season to look at calmly, so we will look at it calmly. Work does not stop. It simply changes shape. The fields rest under frost, but tools must be repaired, fences mended, animals fed carefully from dwindling stores of hay. The village moves inward. Life becomes more centered around the hearth. Inside the cottage, wool spinning becomes a steady rhythm. The wife, perhaps with a daughter beside her, draws out raw wool into thread using a spindle. The motion is repetitive and almost meditative. Twist, pull, twist again. This thread will become cloth. Cloth will become clothing. Clothing will become survival. Cloth is valuable. Nothing is wasted. Old garments are patched until they resemble abstract art. When they are too worn to wear, they become rags. When they are too worn to be rags, they might be used to stuff mattresses. Fabric has a long career in the medieval world. Winter evenings are longer and stories stretch with them. Folk tales drift through the smoky air, tales of saints who endured terrible things with calm expressions, tales of clever peasants who outwitted greedy lords, quiet little fantasies of justice. The children listen wide-eyed, adults nod knowingly. Everyone enjoys imagining that the powerful can occasionally be made to look foolish. Superstition sits comfortably beside religion. The villagers attend church faithfully. They repeat prayers. They observe holy days. And they also avoid walking near certain trees at night, just in case, because the forest, beyond the fields, feels different after sunset. The forest is a place of resources and risk. It provides firewood, berries, mushrooms, and sometimes game, but it also feels older than the village, denser. Stories cling to it, spirits, fairies, wandering souls. No one is entirely sure what is out there. Best to respect it. Let's drift briefly into the home of the village healer. Every village has someone who knows herbs, perhaps an older woman with sharp eyes and steady hands. She knows which leaves ease fever, which roots soothe stomach pain, which plants should absolutely not be touched unless one is tired of living. Her knowledge is practical and passed down quietly. She may also mutter charms under her breath while preparing remedies, a prayer mixed with old words that predate the church. The villagers do not find this strange. They find it comforting. Healing is mysterious. A little ritual helps. When illness spreads, it spreads quietly at first. A cough here, a fever there. The village holds its breath. There are no hospitals, only home care. If the illness passes, relief spreads gently. If it does not, the church bell tolls in a slower, heavier way. Burials are simple. The body is wrapped in cloth and placed in consecrated ground. The priest speaks solemn words. The earth closes over. Life continues. It has to. As winter begins to loosen its grip, there is a collective exhale. Spring is hope in muddy form. The ground softens. The plows come out again. Seeds are brought from storage with careful optimism. Too early and frost will ruin them. Too late and yields will shrink. Timing is everything. There is a quiet thrill in the first green shoots pushing through soil. It feels like proof that endurance was worth it. The village energy shifts outward again. Doors open earlier. Children run between houses. Chickens resume their confident strutting. Spring also brings lambing season if the village keeps sheep. Tiny lambs wobble on thin legs. They are fragile and absurdly small. The shepherd watches them with tired devotion. Each lamb represents wool and possibly meat, survival wrapped in fluff. Let's float toward the edge of the village where a small path leads to a neighboring settlement. Travel is slow. Most people walk. Carts creak along when necessary. The roads are not smooth highways. They are uneven tracks carved by repeated footsteps and wagon wheels. Rain transforms them into mud rivers. Dust rises in dry spells. Travel is an act of patience. News travels with travelers. A passing merchant might bring stories from distant towns. Perhaps there is talk of a new tax or a rumor of unrest somewhere far away. Wars happen. Kings argue. Borders shift. But in the village, these events feel distant, important certainly, but filtered through layers of time and hearsay. Occasionally, soldiers pass through. They are not always polite. The villagers watch cautiously. Armies require food. Food is precious. A visit from armed men is rarely welcome. But this is not a daily occurrence. More often, the village exists in relative isolation. Summer arrives with longer days and relentless labor. The fields must be weeded carefully, crops inspected. Every plant matters. The sun beats down steadily. Skin darkens. Sweat is constant. There is no dramatic complaint, just quiet endurance. Harvest season is the most intense period of the year. Everyone works. Even the smallest children gather stray stalks. Sickle blades flash in rhythmic arcs. Grain is bundled into sheaths and stacked carefully. There is urgency here, but not panic, just focus. If rain threatens during harvest, the entire village feels a shared tension. Grain must dry properly. A poorly timed storm can undo months of effort. The villagers look to the sky frequently. They pray more frequently. When harvest is successful, relief washes through the community like a warm breeze. There may be a small celebration, nothing extravagant, but enough to acknowledge that survival once again has been negotiated. Harvest festivals are among the few times the village truly relaxes. There is music, dancing in a simple circle, extra ale brewed for the occasion, laughter that carries slightly farther than usual. The Lord might host a modest feast at the manor. Generosity, when it appears, is remembered. Autumn follows gently behind harvest. The air cools. Leaves shift color. Animals are slaughtered strategically. It is not grim or dramatic. It is practical. Meat must be salted and stored before winter.
The pig, who has been happily rooting around all year, fulfills its destiny. There is gratitude in the act. Waste would be unthinkable. Smokehouses fill with curing meat. The smell is rich and heavy. Winter stores are counted and recounted. Grain measured, barrels checked. There is quiet calculation. Will it be enough? The cycle repeats, always the cycle. In between the major events, daily life hums steadily. Repairs, small arguments, quiet reconciliations, children growing taller, elders moving slower, the church bell marking time like a patient metronome. Let's gently observe the emotional landscape of the village. Joy is modest, sorrow is steady but not theatrical. Life is lived in practical tones. There is no expectation of comfort as a constant state. Comfort, when it appears, is appreciated deeply. A warm loaf of bread, a healthy newborn, a field free of pests, a neighbor offering help without being asked. These are victories. Romance exists, though it rarely resembles courtly poems. A husband may carve a small token for his wife. A wife may save the softest piece of bread for her husband. Affection is shown in shared labor and quiet loyalty. Arguments happen, of course they do, over land boundaries, over wandering animals, over misunderstandings amplified by fatigue. But grudges rarely last long. Cooperation is essential. Survival requires it. As another year draws toward its close, the village does not mark it with fireworks. There is no dramatic declaration, just another winter approaching, another set of fields waiting for spring. The rhythm continues, and through it all the village endures, not loudly, not heroically, just steadily. Tomorrow will begin the same way it always does, with that rooster full of confidence, with smoke curling into the morning air, with hands reaching for tools, with quiet hope resting in small seeds. And we will stay here a little longer still, drifting through this calm, repetitive, surprisingly resilient world.
The village does not exist on its own. It feels self-contained, yes. Mud, fields, smoke, chickens with strong opinions. But above it, around it, pressing lightly on every roof of thatch, there are structures of power. Soft, steady, unavoidable. And the villagers live beneath them in the same way they live beneath the sky, not arguing with it, just adjusting. Let's begin with the church bell. It hangs in the small stone tower, slightly uneven, slightly weathered, and deeply important. When it rings in the morning, people rise. When it rings for prayer, they pause. When it tolls slowly, everyone knows what it means. The priest is not a grand bishop wrapped in silk. He is usually the educated son of someone from a nearby town. He knows Latin. He owns books. This alone makes him extraordinary in a place where most knowledge is carried in memory rather than ink. He performs Mass each Sunday. The villagers stand or kneel on the cold stone floor. They do not fully understand the Latin words, but they understand the structure. There is comfort in repetition. The ritual is familiar. It holds the week together. The priest also records baptisms, marriages, and deaths. He is the keeper of the village timeline. In a world without birth certificates or government databases, the church ledger is as close as it gets to permanence. He hears confessions in a quiet corner, minor sins mostly, irritation with neighbors, skipped prayers, occasional dishonesty about how much grain was actually harvested. Nothing dramatic, just human nature in muddy boots. The church building itself is one of the few stone structures in the village. Thick walls, narrow windows, cool in summer, cold in winter. It smells faintly of wax and damp stone. Inside, painted images of saints watch silently. Some villagers cannot read, but they can interpret images. The walls teach stories in color and gesture. Religion provides explanation for everything that cannot be explained. A failed harvest, a sudden illness, a violent storm. All of it fits into a divine plan, even if that plan seems occasionally confusing, especially confusing. And yet, alongside this sacred authority, there is the manor court. Now, this is less about salvation and more about sheep. The manor court meets several times a year. It is not grand. There are no dramatic gavels, just the lord or his steward seated at a table listening to disputes. Villagers gather around, caps in hand. Someone's pig wandered into someone else's garden. Someone failed to repair a fence. Someone missed a required Labor Day on the Lord's domain fields. The issues are practical. The consequences are usually fines. Fines are paid in grain or small coins. Coins, when they appear, feel oddly heavy. Metal currency is not part of everyday exchange. Most transactions are in goods and labor. A chicken for some wool, a sack of grain for tool repair. The Lord's steward keeps records, lists of who owes what, lists of obligations fulfilled or neglected. It is quiet bureaucracy, medieval style. Now, the Lord himself might not even live here full time. He could have multiple manors scattered across the countryside. He visits periodically. When he does, the village becomes slightly more alert, slightly more tidy. He arrives on horseback, perhaps with a small entourage. His clothes are richer in color, his boots cleaner, his belt heavier with metal fittings. He eats in the manor hall. The villagers bow or nod respectfully. He represents not just local authority, but a link upward to the wider kingdom. Above him is a greater lord. Above that lord, perhaps a duke or earl. And somewhere at the top, a king. The king is almost mythical to the villagers. They may never see him. His decrees filter down slowly through layers of authority. Taxes may increase because of a war far away. New laws might be announced. But the daily rhythm of the village changes only slightly. Wars happen, armies march, borders shift, yet most villagers remain anchored to their fields. If soldiers pass through, they are tolerated carefully. If levies are demanded, young men might leave temporarily carrying simple weapons and uncertain expectations. Most would prefer to return to plowing. Let's drift back into ordinary life. Justice in the village is communal and practical. Reputation matters deeply. Everyone knows everyone. If someone is lazy, everyone knows it. If someone is generous, everyone knows that too. Social pressure maintains order more effectively than written law. To be ostracized is dangerous. Cooperation is survival. A man who refuses to help at harvest may find fewer hands helping him later. There is hierarchy, certainly. The lord above, the priest beside him, wealthier peasants, known as villeins, who hold slightly larger strips of land, poorer laborers with less security. But these differences are subtle compared to the vast gulf between peasant and noble. Let's gently examine food again, because food is always central. Daily meals are modest. Pottage remains the dependable hero of the medieval kitchen. A stew of grains and vegetables, simmering continuously. Sometimes onions, cabbage, leeks, perhaps bits of salted pork in winter. Flavor is built slowly. White bread, made from fine wheat flour, is rare for peasants. Dark rye or barley bread dominates. It is dense, filling, slightly sour. Milk from cows or goats becomes cheese and butter. Eggs appear regularly. Fish might come from nearby streams, especially on church-mandated fast days when meat is avoided. Spices are nearly unknown in the village. Pepper exists somewhere in the world, cinnamon too, but they belong to distant trade networks and wealthy kitchens. The villagers season their food mostly with salt and herbs from their gardens. Now, let's pause by the village green. Children play here when chores are done. Their games are simple. Running, throwing stones at a target, mock sword fights with sticks. They invent worlds from imagination and whatever scraps are nearby. There are no manufactured toys, no painted dolls from a distant workshop, but creativity does not require polished surfaces. As children grow, their futures are fairly predictable.
Sons will likely farm. Daughters will likely marry into neighboring families. Occasionally, a particularly bright boy might be sent to serve the church and receive education. This is rare, but possible. Let's talk briefly about crime. Serious crime is uncommon in small villages. Theft within the community is risky. Everyone notices missing items. Punishments can include fines, public humiliation, or in more serious cases, harsher penalties imposed by higher courts. Public humiliation might mean standing in the stocks, head and hands locked in wooden boards for hours while neighbors observe. It is uncomfortable and deeply embarrassing, but it reinforces order without permanent damage. Now, slowly, let's consider time itself. Time is not divided into minutes and seconds. It is divided into natural markers: sunrise, midday, sunset, seasons, feast days, harvest. There is no hurry in the modern sense. Tasks are completed when they are completed. Urgency appears only when weather threatens or food runs low. The pace of life is slower, but not idle. There is always something that needs to be done, always a fence that leans slightly, a tool that dulls, a roof that sheds a bit too much straw in the wind. Even leisure is modest. Occasional traveling entertainers might pass through, a minstrel with a lute, a storyteller with dramatic gestures. They bring songs of distant places, of knights and queens and cities with stone walls taller than imagination. The villagers listen with fascination, then they return to their fields the next morning. Because fantasy is pleasant, but wheat still needs harvesting. As dusk settles once more, the village quiets again under the watch of the church tower. The bell does not ring now, it rests. The manor hall dims. The fields lie silent. Inside the cottages, fires glow softly. Families sit close. The world feels small but complete. Power exists above them, yes. Kings argue, lords collect, priests preach. But here, in this little cluster of timber and smoke, life remains steady. The rooster will speak again at dawn. The bell will answer. The plow will carve its lines into the earth once more. And the village, pressed gently between heaven and hierarchy, will continue exactly as it has for generations.
By now, the rhythm of the village feels almost familiar. The bell rings, the plow moves, the pottage simmers. The seasons circle back without apology. But beneath that steady surface, something else moves just as constantly. Bodies age. Illness drifts in and out. Time leaves its fingerprints on everyone, even if no one is keeping exact track of their birthday. Let's move gently into one of the cottages again. The grandfather sits closest to the hearth. He was once the strongest man in his strip of land. Now his hands tremble slightly when he lifts his cup of weak ale. His back curves forward like a question mark that will never quite be answered. He does not work the fields much anymore. Instead, he mends small tools, tells stories, watches the youngest children with sharp but patient eyes. In a world without pensions or retirement plans, old age depends entirely on family. If you raised your children well, they keep you near the fire. If you did not, well, medieval life can be unforgiving. Aging here is visible. There are no cosmetics to smooth it over. Teeth are often missing. Skin is weathered by sun and wind. Hands are thick and calloused. 35 can look elderly. 50 feels ancient. Anyone reaching 60 becomes something close to a local legend. Illness is never far away. A simple cut can become dangerous. A fever can turn serious in days. There are no antibiotics. There are no precise diagnoses. There is observation, herbs, prayer, and hope. The healer might brew a mixture of willow bark for pain, honey for wounds, garlic for infections. Some remedies work. Some work accidentally. Some do very little at all. but they are tried with steady faith. When sickness spreads through the village, it moves quietly at first, one child coughing, then another. The mothers exchange worried glances at the well. The priest visits homes more frequently. The bell rings more often in that slow, heavy rhythm no one enjoys hearing. There are larger outbreaks, too. Plagues that sweep across regions like invisible storms. The Black Death, when it comes in the 14th century, changes everything. But for now, in our calm little village, sickness is smaller, personal, local. Still frightening, but not yet catastrophic. Death is not hidden away. Children understand it early. When someone dies, the body remains in the home briefly. Neighbors visit, prayers are said, candles flicker softly. Then burial follows in the churchyard, close to the stone walls that have watched generations pass. Gravestones, if they exist, are simple. Many graves are unmarked. Memory lives mostly in stories. In "Do you remember old Thomas who always argued about fence posts?" In "She made the best bread in the village." Legacy is modest. And yet, life continues with quiet insistence. A baby is born in another cottage. The midwife arrives quickly, carrying cloths and steady hands. Childbirth is common, but never casual. It is dangerous. There are no surgical rooms, only a wooden bed, whispered encouragement, and the hope that both mother and child will see morning. When a baby's cry fills the room, relief spreads like warmth from the hearth. The infant is baptized soon after, often within days. Infant mortality is high, and the church wants no delay in securing the child's soul. The ceremony is simple: a few drops of water, a name spoken clearly. Names repeat often: John, William, Mary, Agnes. Names cycle through families like the seasons themselves. Let's drift into adolescence. There is no long, indulgent teenage phase here. Childhood shifts into adulthood gradually but firmly. Around 12 or 13, boys begin taking on heavier labor. Girls learn the full management of household tasks. Responsibility grows steadily, like crops in spring. Courtship is subtle. A shared glance during a festival, walking home from the well together, perhaps exchanging a small handmade token. Nothing dramatic, just quiet alignment of futures. Marriage binds not just two individuals, but two families. Land arrangements are discussed carefully. Dowries are modest but meaningful. A cow, a few tools, some cloth. These are serious negotiations. Once married, a young couple might live with the husband's family until they can establish their own household. Space is tight, privacy minimal, but cooperation is strong. Now, let's consider fear. Fear in a medieval village is rarely about sudden monsters. It is about gradual decline, a poor harvest, a spreading illness, a cow that stops producing milk. These are the true threats. There is also fear of divine displeasure. A storm that flattens crops might be interpreted as punishment. The priest reassures, more prayers are offered, perhaps a small procession is held, asking for protection. Superstitions blend easily with faith. Charms are hung near doors. Certain days are considered unlucky for beginning major tasks. If something goes wrong, explanations are sought in both heaven and hedge. And still, there are moments of lightness. Music drifts through the village occasionally, a simple flute, a drum, voices raised in song after a successful harvest, dancing in a circle, hands linked loosely, feet stamping dust into the evening air. Ale flows more freely during these gatherings, not strong enough to cause chaos, but enough to soften edges. Laughter hums gently. For a moment, the weight of survival feels lighter. Even humor exists in small ways.
Jokes about the miller taking more flour than he should. Teasing about who slipped in the mud most spectacularly last week. Laughter is brief, but sincere. Now, let's talk about weather again, because weather shapes everything. A harsh winter can empty grain stores faster than planned. A dry summer can reduce yields drastically. The villagers read signs constantly: the color of the sky at dusk, the direction of the wind, the behavior of animals. They do not control nature, they negotiate with it. Some years are generous. Harvests are abundant. Bellies are full. There is even a small surplus to sell at market. These years feel almost luxurious. Repairs are made. A new cloak might be purchased. Optimism grows cautiously. Other years are thin. Meals shrink. Anxiety grows. Bread is stretched with additional grains. Portions are smaller. The pig, if slaughtered, is rationed carefully. No one says the word famine unless necessary. Community becomes even more important in lean times. Families share what they can. The Lord may reduce rents slightly if he is practical. Starving peasants cannot work fields. Survival is mutual. As time drifts forward, the village changes slowly. Children grow into adults. Adults become elders. New cottages are built from the same timber and mud as the old ones. Roofs are replaced. Tools are reshaped. But the overall picture remains remarkably consistent. There are no revolutions here, no grand technological leaps. Change creeps rather than storms. If a new plow design arrives from a neighboring region, it is examined carefully. If it works better, it is gradually adopted. Innovation is welcome, but only if it proves itself practical. And so years stack gently atop one another. The grandfather by the fire eventually does not wake one morning. The family mourns quietly. The priest performs the rites. Life continues. The youngest child now occupies the space closest to the hearth. Another baby is born. Another harvest is gathered. Another winter passes. From the outside, it might seem monotonous, but inside the village, it feels full. Every day carries small variations, slight differences in weather, subtle shifts in relationships, minor triumphs and disappointments. The church bell still rings. The manor court still settles arguments about sheep. The fields still demand attention. And under it all, time moves in a steady, unhurried line, not racing, just gently guiding each villager from cradle to field to hearth to grave. Tomorrow will look much like today, and that, in this world, is not a complaint, it is reassurance. We will stay a little longer, because even in repetition, there are still corners left to wander.
By now, the village feels settled. The fields breathe in and out with the seasons. The church bell marks time with patient authority. Generations pass through the same low doorways, ducking slightly so as not to knock into the timber beams overhead. But every so often, the outside world drifts a little closer. Not dramatically, not with trumpets, just with carts creaking along the road. Market day begins earlier than usual. A few villagers rise in the deeper dark, gathering small goods to trade. A basket of eggs, a wrapped round of cheese, perhaps a bundle of wool carefully tied with twine. These are precious things, handled with care. The journey to the nearest town might take several hours on foot. The path is uneven, cut by wagon wheels and softened by last week's rain. Shoes grow damp, cloaks gather burrs, but there is a quiet sense of anticipation. The market is as close as medieval village life comes to something bustling. As the town comes into view, it feels almost overwhelming. More houses, taller buildings, stone walls in some places. The faint outline of a larger church tower rising above everything else. The noise alone feels different. Vendors calling out, animals braying, hammering from workshops. For villagers accustomed to 20 or 30 cottages, a town of a few thousand people might as well be another universe. The market square hums gently with activity. Stalls display goods that do not exist in the village. Fine cloth dyed in colors that look almost suspiciously bright. Metal tools polished to a shine. Barrels of salted fish from coastal regions far away. Perhaps even small packets of spices locked behind higher prices and watchful eyes. Salt is a common purchase. It preserves meat and enhances flavor, and its importance cannot be overstated. A little salt can make winter stores last longer. It is worth the long walk. Occasionally, a villager might see something astonishing. A book for sale, a small mirror made of polished metal, a piece of jewelry worn by someone wealthier. These objects shimmer with possibility, but usually remain just beyond practical reach. Trade is careful. Coins exchange hands, but not often. Barter still dominates. A sack of grain for a tool repair. Eggs for a length of coarse cloth. Each exchange involves negotiation that is polite but firm. After a few hours, the villagers begin their slow journey home. The town shrinks behind them. The familiar fields reappear. Smoke from their own cottages rises in thin gray lines. The world contracts again to its comfortable size. Now, let's settle into another important part of village life. Marriage, not as ceremony, but as daily reality. Once the feast is over and the music fades, marriage becomes partnership in survival. A husband and wife rise together before dawn. They divide tasks without dramatic discussion. He may head to the fields, she may begin kneading dough or spinning wool. Later, their roles might overlap completely during harvest. Affection exists, though it is rarely displayed with grand gestures. It appears in shared glances across the field, in the way one saves the last bit of cheese for the other, in quiet loyalty during difficult seasons. Disagreements happen. Of course they do. Fatigue can sharpen tempers. Lean harvests can magnify small irritations. But separation is rare and difficult. Marriage binds property, labor, and reputation together. It is both emotional and economic. Children fill the small house quickly. A cradle near the hearth, a toddler weaving between stools, older siblings already carrying small buckets of water from the well. Discipline is practical. There are no long philosophical debates about child psychology. Children are expected to contribute as soon as they are able, not harshly, but firmly. Work is life. Now, let's gently visit the blacksmith again. His forge glows brighter in the dim interior of his workshop. Sparks leap upward like tiny stars before fading. The steady clang of hammer on metal feels almost musical in its repetition. He shapes plow tips, horseshoes, hinges, nails. Without him, the village slows dramatically. Tools dull, doors sag, carts break. His skill is essential. He may earn slightly more than the average peasant. Not wealth exactly, but stability. His children might inherit the trade. Skills pass from father to son, or occasionally to a daughter if she proves capable and willing. The manor, too, continues his work by the stream. The water wheel turns steadily, powered by the quiet force of current. Inside, grain is ground into flour. Dust proots everything in a fine white layer. He collects his share as payment, carefully measured, but occasionally debated. Mild suspicion of the miller persists across medieval Europe, perhaps because he handles food in its most vital form, perhaps because power, even small power, invites commentary. Now, let's move toward the manor house once more. The lord may host occasional gatherings, minor feasts, meetings with neighboring landholders. Compared to royal courts, these are modest affairs, but to the villagers they feel refined. Inside the manor hall, tapestries hang on walls. A long table stretches down the center. Candles flicker in iron holders. The lord eats white bread, roasted meats, perhaps even imported wine. Yet even here, life is not without inconvenience. The hall can be drafty. Smoke from the central hearth lingers under the rafters. Comfort is relative. The lord's children grow up with slightly broader horizons. A son might be sent to train as a knight. A daughter might marry into another minor noble family. Their lives are less muddy, but equally structured by expectation. Above all of this hovers the distant presence of the king. Royal decrees occasionally ripple down to the village. A new tax to fund a war. A regulation about forest use. Restrictions on hunting, which is often reserved for the nobility. If a peasant is caught hunting deer in the lord's forest, consequences can be severe. The forest then becomes both resource and boundary. Firewood may be gathered in limited quantities. Pigs may forage for acorns in autumn, a practice known as pannage, but deer and larger game are protected. This hierarchy shapes daily choices quietly but firmly. Now, as evening settles once more, let's consider the emotional geography of this small world. Most villagers will never see the ocean, never visit a royal court, never travel beyond a handful of neighboring towns. Their world is defined by walking distance. And yet, within that small radius, life feels full, complex, layered. Friendships form over years of shared labor. Rivalries simmer gently and then dissolve. Love grows slowly like crops in good soil. There are moments of pride, a particularly successful harvest, a new roof completed before winter, a child who learns a prayer perfectly. There are also moments of quiet envy, the lord's better boots, the merchant's colorful cloak. But envy rarely dominates. Survival requires focus. The stars overhead remain constant companions. Without city lights, the night sky is vast and detailed. Constellations are known not by scientific charts, but by stories passed down. Patterns that guide planting seasons, patterns that inspire wonder. As we settle into the end of another day, the village returns to its familiar stillness. Animals rustle softly in pens. The stream near the mill continues its steady murmur. The church tower stands against the dark sky, patient and unmoving. Inside the cottages, fires dim gradually. One by one, families drift into sleep on straw mattresses beneath wool blankets. The world beyond the village continues its grand dramas. Kings argue, armies march, trade routes expand. But here, in this small circle of timber and field and bell, life remains measured by soil and sun. And tomorrow, once again, the rooster will declare the dawn as if it were entirely his idea. The village will arise, and we will continue drifting gently through its steady, unhurried days.
Winter returns the way it always does, quietly at first. A sharper wind, a thinner sun, frost edging the fields in pale silver. The harvest is long finished now. The grain is stored in sacks and barrels. The salted meat hangs from beams. The root vegetables rest in cool earth. Everything has been measured and estimated and quietly worried over. Winter is not dramatic. It is patient. The days shorten until it feels like the sun barely bothers to rise. Morning chores happen in dim light. Evening arrives early, folding the village into shadow while there is still work left undone. Food becomes more repetitive now. Pottage thickens with stored grains and whatever vegetables remain firm enough to slice. Dried peas, barley, cabbage that has seen better days but still contributes. A small piece of salted pork might be added on Sundays, shaved carefully as though it were gold. There is no snacking, no cupboards filled with variety. Meals are deliberate
and measured. Each spoonful is part of a plan stretching towards spring. Let's step inside one of the cottages again. The family sits close together near the hearth. The fire is smaller than in autumn. Wood must last. Smoke curls upward, escaping imperfectly through the roof vent. The air smells of ash and wool. The youngest child asks how long until spring. The answer is vague. Soon enough. Time in winter feels slower. The fields are quiet. There is less visible progress, no green shoots to admire. Just endurance. Winter hunger is not always starvation. It is often simply less. Slightly smaller portions, a thinner layer of fat on the stew, a more careful rationing of cheese. Some years are harsher than others. If the previous harvest was weak, anxiety lingers like a draft under the door. The villagers count their stores again. The pig, once so round and confident, is now a memory, salted and hung. But even in this careful season, there are moments of warmth. Midwinter festivals bring light into the darkness. Candles burn longer. The church glows softly during special services. There may be singing that echoes against the stone walls. The sound feels fuller in winter, as if the cold air carries it more clearly. On Christmas, the village slows its labor. A better meal is prepared. A loaf made from the finest remaining flour, perhaps a bit more meat than usual. Children receive small tokens, a carved wooden animal, a strip of bright thread. Nothing extravagant, but enough to feel noticed. Snow falls occasionally, softening the sharp edges of the village. Roofs appear smoother. Paths disappear under white blankets. For a brief moment, everything looks clean and almost magical. Then the snow melts into mud because this is still a medieval village after all. Let's wander toward the forest again. In winter, the forest feels deeper and quieter. Bare branches stretch upward like skeletal fingers. The ground crunches underfoot. Wood gathering continues, though carefully. The forest belongs partly to the Lord. Rules govern how much may be taken. Villagers respect these limits, mostly. Firewood is essential. So are good relations with authority. Sometimes hunters pass through the woods, noblemen with bows and fine cloaks. They pursue deer for status and stature. The villagers watch from a distance. Hunting large game without permission can bring severe punishment. So they content themselves with smaller animals when possible. Rabbits, birds, quietly and cautiously. Now let's sit with the elders again. Winter is when memory stretches longest. Stories are told in greater detail. Tales of previous harsh winters, of years when the river froze solid enough to walk across, of a summer so wet the grain nearly drowned. The village remembers collectively. Its history is not written in books. It is spoken around fires, passed from mouth to ear, generation to generation. There are stories of distant wars, too, of kings who fought bravely, or foolishly. It is difficult to know which. The villagers receive these stories months after events occur. The details blur in the telling. What remains is the sense that the world beyond is unpredictable and loud, while the village is steady and known. As winter inches forward, illness sometimes tightens its grip. Colds spread in close quarters. Coughs echo in the night. The healer works steadily, mixing herbs into steaming cups. The priest visits homes, offering prayers and reassurance. When someone grows very weak, the entire household shifts around them. Work is redistributed. Neighbors help. Meals are shared more generously than usual. In small communities, loss is never private. But survival is not only about endurance, it is also about adaptation. Tools are improved slowly. A slightly sharper plow blade, a sturdier hinge on the barn door. The blacksmith experiments in small ways. Nothing revolutionary, just practical refinements. Clothing is patched again and again. Layers are added in winter.
wool cloaks pulled tight, linen shirts beneath heavier tunics, hands chapped and rough from cold water and wind. And still there are moments of unexpected delight. A clear winter night reveals stars sharper than ever. The sky feels close enough to touch. Constellations stand out boldly. The Milky Way stretches across the darkness like spilled flour. Children tilt their heads back and try to count what cannot be counted. Sometimes a traveler arrives even in winter, a merchant delayed by weather, a messenger carrying news. The village gathers quietly to listen. Stories of distant cities where buildings scrape the sky, of ships larger than cottages, of markets overflowing with spices and silk. The villagers listen, half believing, half skeptical. Their own world feels more solid, more reliable. Eventually, almost imperceptibly, winter begins to loosen its hold. The days lengthen by minutes at first. The air softens slightly. Snow gives way to damp earth. The first birds return, testing the branches cautiously. The village feels the shift before it fully sees it. Hope returns in subtle ways. Grain stores are checked one more time. Seeds are brought out and examined carefully. Tools are inspected for the coming labor. Spring is not a sudden explosion. It is a slow permission to begin again. The plow returns to the fields. The ox leans into the harness. Soil turns over in dark, rich lines. Seeds scatter from calloused hands. And just like that, the cycle resumes. The hunger of winter fades into the effort of planting. The long nights shorten. The hearth fire burns less fiercely as sunlight lingers. The village does not celebrate loudly. It simply moves forward, again. Children who were small at the start of winter are slightly taller now. Elders who told stories by the fire sit a little quieter. Life has shifted subtly, as it always does. And through it all, the church bell remains steady. The manor stands slightly apart. The forest watches from the edge. The medieval village continues, day after day, season after season. Not glamorous, not heroic, just enduring. Tomorrow the rooster will announce another dawn. The fields will demand attention. The pottage will simmer once more. And the village, with its long memory and small joys, will rise to meet it calmly.
Spring does not always bring relief. Most years, yes, the soil softens, the seeds go in, green returns in thin, hopeful lines across the brown earth. The villagers breathe a little easier. But sometimes the rain does not behave. Let's imagine one of those years. Not dramatic, not apocalyptic, just persistently inconvenient. It begins with too much rain. Not a violent storm, just steady, stubborn drizzle that refuses to leave. The fields grow heavy with water. Seeds struggle in soil that feels more like soup. Boots sink deeper than usual. The oxen move reluctantly. The villagers glance at the sky more often. They do not complain loudly. Complaining does not change clouds. They work anyway. Weeks pass. The rain continues. Some crops sprout unevenly. Patches of green appear beside patches of nothing at all. The wheat looks thin, the barley shorter than it should be. It is not a disaster yet, just concerning. The priest adds extra prayers for favorable weather. A small procession moves through the village, stopping at the edges of the fields. Holy water is sprinkled lightly. Words are spoken. Everyone nods, because doing something feels better than doing nothing. Eventually, the rain stops. But now the sun arrives with more intensity than expected. The soil dries too quickly. Cracks form. The crops that survived the wet now struggle in the heat. This is how famine begins. Not with a single dramatic event, with imbalance. Harvest comes, and the yield is smaller. Not empty, but noticeably thinner. Sheaves are fewer, bundles lighter. The village feels the difference immediately. Grain stores are counted carefully. The usual comfortable margin is gone. What remains must stretch further. Meals grow slightly smaller again. Meat is rationed more strictly. The pig, if one remains, becomes even more valuable. Chickens are guarded closely. Eggs are no longer traded casually. No one panics openly. Panic wastes energy. Instead, there is quiet calculation. The Lord may or may not reduce rents. Some do, some do not. A generous Lord understands that starving peasants cannot farm next year. A stubborn one insists on his due regardless of thin fields. History offers examples of both. If the shortage continues into a second year, the mood shifts further. Wild plants are gathered more frequently from the forest. Acorns are ground into flour despite their bitterness. Bread becomes denser, harder. Travelers passing through speak of similar troubles in neighboring villages. The problem is not local, it is regional, perhaps even wider. And yet, even here, survival finds a way. Villagers share what they can. Families with slightly larger stores lend to those with less. Debts are noted, but compassion often outweighs strict accounting. Community becomes more visible during hardship. Children still play, though perhaps more quietly. The church still holds services. The blacksmith still hammers at his forge. Life narrows, but it does not vanish. Then, eventually, the weather balances again. A year of better rainfall, a more generous sun. Crops return thicker and taller. Harvest regains its reassuring weight. Relief spreads through the village not with celebration, but with deep, quiet gratitude. The pottage thickens once more. The bread feels heavier in the hand. Bellies fill more comfortably. Famine leaves memory behind. It shapes caution. It teaches restraint. It reinforces the understanding that fortune is fragile. Now, let's drift into another subtle change. Over time, the wider world begins to press more firmly against village life. Roads improve slightly. Trade increases. Coins appear more frequently in transactions. A nearby town grows larger. Craftsmen specialize further. Cloth becomes easier to purchase rather than produce entirely at home. Some villagers begin to imagine alternatives. A younger son with little land to inherit might leave to town to apprentice with a tradesman. A daughter might marry into a household slightly farther away than usual. The radius of life expands by small degrees. These changes are slow, generational. The feudal structure itself begins to shift gradually in parts of Europe. Labor shortages after major plagues increase the value of workers. Serfs sometimes negotiate better terms. Wages in certain regions begin to replace strict labor obligations. Our village feels these tremors gently, like distant thunder. Perhaps one year, instead of owing only labor days, a peasant pays part of his obligation in coin. It feels different, less physically binding, slightly more flexible. The manor court still meets, the church bell still rings, but there's a faint sense that the world is not entirely fixed. Let's step back into daily life again, because despite these shifts, most days remain reassuringly ordinary. The fields are plowed, seeds are sown, children are born, elders pass away, cottages are repaired, roofs are rethatched carefully before winter winds arrive. Clothing remains simple, wool and linen, earth-toned and practical, though perhaps occasionally a brighter ribbon appears in a girl's hair, purchased from a town market, a tiny splash of color against the brown and green world. Food remains steady. Pottage still simmers. Bread still forms the backbone of survival. Cheese, onions, beans. The flavors do not change dramatically, but small improvements feel meaningful. Even leisure evolves slowly.
Traveling performers become slightly more common as roads improve. Songs from distant regions drift into the village repertoire. Stories expand beyond purely local legends. And yet, still, the pace remains unhurried. The medieval village does not rush toward progress. It absorbs change gradually, like soil absorbing rain. As the years continue to roll forward, generations look back on earlier times with quiet nostalgia. Do you remember when the river flooded so badly? Do you remember the year the harvest failed? Memory binds the community together. Some cottages stand for decades. Others collapse and are rebuilt in the same spot. The layout of the village remains familiar even as individual families shift within it. Let's sit one more time near the hearth at the end of another long day. The fire glows softly. A pot of stew simmers gently. Outside, the wind moves through thatched roofs with a low whisper. The church tower stands silhouetted against a sky scattered with stars. The world beyond continues its vast, complicated story. Kingdoms rise and fall, borders shift, new ideas travel slowly along trade routes. But here, in this small medieval village, life continues in cycles. Hunger and abundance, birth and burial, rain and sun, work and rest. There is no grand climax, no dramatic transformation, just a steady, patient unfolding of ordinary days. And tomorrow, as always, the rooster will lift his voice before the sun has fully decided to appear. Smoke will curl upward into the pale morning air. Boots will step on damp earth. The village will awake. And it will continue, calmly and persistently, exactly as it has for generations.
Spring does not always bring relief. Most years, yes, the soil softens, the seeds go in, green returns in thin, hopeful lines across the brown earth. The villagers breathe a little easier. But sometimes the rain does not behave. Let's imagine one of those years. Not dramatic, not apocalyptic, just persistently inconvenient. It begins with too much rain. Not a violent storm, just steady, stubborn drizzle that refuses to leave. The fields grow heavy with water. Seeds struggle in soil that feels more like soup. Boots sink deeper than usual. The oxen move reluctantly. The villagers glance at the sky more often. They do not complain loudly. Complaining does not change clouds. They work anyway. Weeks pass. The rain continues. Some crops sprout unevenly. Patches of green appear beside patches of nothing at all. The wheat looks thin. The barley shorter than it should be. It is not a disaster yet, just concerning. The priest adds extra prayers for favorable weather. A small procession moves through the village, stopping at the edges of the fields. Holy water is sprinkled lightly. Words are spoken. Everyone nods because doing something feels better than doing nothing. Eventually, the rain stops. But now the sun arrives with more intensity than expected. The soil dries too quickly. Cracks form. The crops that survived the wet now struggle in the heat. This is how famine begins. Not with a single dramatic event, with imbalance. Harvest comes and the yield is smaller, not empty, but noticeably thinner. Sheaves are fewer, bundles lighter. The village feels the difference immediately. Grain stores are counted carefully. The usual comfortable margin is gone. What remains must stretch further. Meals grow slightly smaller again. Meat is rationed more strictly. The pig, if one remains, becomes even more valuable. Chickens are guarded closely. Eggs are no longer traded casually. No one panics openly. Panic wastes energy. Instead, there is quiet calculation. The Lord may or may not reduce rents. Some do, some do not. A generous Lord understands that starving peasants cannot farm next year. A stubborn one insists on his due regardless of thin fields. History offers examples of both. If the shortage continues into a second year, the mood shifts further. Wild plants are gathered more frequently from the forest. Acorns are ground into flour despite their bitterness.
Bread becomes denser, harder. Travelers passing through speak of similar troubles in neighboring villages. The problem is not local, it is regional, perhaps even wider. And yet, even here, survival finds a way. Villagers share what they can. Families with slightly larger stores lend to those with less. Debts are noted, but compassion often outweighs strict accounting. Community becomes more visible during hardship. Children still play, though perhaps more quietly. The church still holds services. The blacksmith still hammers at his forge. Life narrows, but it does not vanish. Then, eventually, the weather balances again. A year of better rainfall, a more generous sun. Crops return thicker and taller. Harvest regains its reassuring weight. Relief spreads through the village not with celebration, but with deep, quiet gratitude. The pottage thickens once more. The bread feels heavier in the hand. Bellies fill more comfortably. Famine leaves memory behind. It shapes caution. It teaches restraint. It reinforces the understanding that fortune is fragile. Now let's drift into another subtle change. Over time, the wider world begins to press more firmly against village life. Roads improve slightly, trade increases, coins appear more frequently in transactions. A nearby town grows larger. Craftsmen specialize further. Cloth becomes easier to purchase rather than produce entirely at home. Some villagers begin to imagine alternatives. A younger son with little land to inherit might leave for town to apprentice with a tradesman. A daughter might marry into a household slightly farther away than usual. The radius of life expands by small degrees. These changes are slow, generational. The feudal structure itself begins to shift gradually in parts of Europe. Labor shortages after major plagues increase the value of workers. Serfs sometimes negotiate better terms. Wages in certain regions begin to replace strict labor obligations. Our village feels these tremors gently, like distant thunder. Perhaps one year, instead of owing only labor days, a peasant pays part of his obligation in coin. It feels different, less physically binding, slightly more flexible. The manor court still meets, the church bell still rings, but there is a faint sense that the world is not entirely fixed. Let's step back into daily life again, because despite these shifts, most days remain reassuringly ordinary. The fields are plowed, seeds are sown, children are born, elders pass away, cottages are repaired, roofs are rethatched carefully before winter winds arrive. Clothing remains simple, wool and linen, earth-toned and practical, though perhaps occasionally a brighter ribbon appears in a girl's hair, purchased from a town market, a tiny splash of color against the brown and green world. Food remains steady, pottage still simmers, bread still forms the backbone of survival. Cheese, onions, beans. The flavors do not change dramatically, but small improvements feel meaningful. Even leisure evolves slowly. Traveling performers become slightly more common as roads improve. Songs from distant regions drift into the village repertoire. Stories expand beyond purely local legends, and still the pace remains unhurried. The medieval village does not rush toward progress. It absorbs change gradually, like soil absorbing rain. As the years continue to roll forward, generations look back on earlier times with quiet nostalgia. Do you remember when the river flooded so badly? Do you remember the year the harvest failed? Memory binds the community together. Some cottages stand for decades, others collapse and are rebuilt in the same spot. The layout of the village remains familiar even as individual families shift within it. Let's sit one more time near the hearth at the end of another long day. The fire glows softly, a pot of stew simmers gently. Outside, the wind moves through thatched roofs with a low whisper. The church tower stands silhouetted against a sky scattered with stars. The world beyond continues its vast, complicated story. Kingdoms rise and fall, borders shift, new ideas travel slowly along trade routes. But here, in this small medieval village, life continues in cycles. Hunger and abundance, birth and burial, rain and sun, work and rest. There is no grand climax, no dramatic transformation, just a steady, patient unfolding of ordinary days. And tomorrow, as always, the rooster will lift his voice before the sun has fully decided to appear. Smoke will curl upward into the pale morning air. Boots will step on damp earth. The village will awake, and it will continue, calmly and persistently, exactly as it has for generations.
After the plague, the village never quite returns to what it was. It is still a cluster of timber houses, still wrapped in fields, still governed by bell and season, but something subtle has shifted in the air, like the moment after a storm when the world feels rearranged. The empty cottages do not all fill again. Some collapse slowly, beams sinking into damp soil. Their wood is salvaged for repairs elsewhere, their thatch reused. Medieval recycling is efficient, if nothing else. The land, however, remains. With fewer people, each surviving family tends slightly wider strips. There is space now, not abundance exactly, but breathing room. Labor has become valuable. In some regions of Europe, peasants begin asking for wages instead of simply fulfilling labor obligations. They bargain carefully, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Lords push back. Laws are passed attempting to fix wages at old levels, as if legislation can command reality. But reality has changed. Young men leave more freely. They travel to towns, seeking apprenticeships. Guilds in growing cities accept new members cautiously. Crafts become specialized: blacksmithing, weaving, carpentry, tanning. Skills are refined beyond the needs of a single village. Towns swell slowly. Markets expand. Stone replaces timber in certain places. Roads improve by increments. Back in the village, daily life continues with its familiar rhythms, but it now exists alongside this expanding world. Let's walk again through the fields. The plow still cuts the soil. Oxen still lean forward with steady strength. But tools have improved slightly. Iron plowshares are more common. Farming methods refine over time. Yields increase gradually in some areas. The three-field system remains, but experimentation begins. Different crop rotations, slightly better drainage, incremental changes. Nothing flashy, just practical adjustments passed from neighbor to neighbor. Inside the cottages, spinning wheels become more widespread, replacing the simple spindle in some regions. Thread can be made faster. Cloth production increases. Clothing remains plain, but perhaps slightly better fitted. A touch more variety in color if trade has improved access to dyes. The church still anchors the village center. Services continue. Holy days mark the calendar. But faith, after the plague, carries a different tone. Some cling to it more tightly. Others harbor quiet doubts. If God allowed such suffering, what does that mean? These questions are rarely voiced openly, but they drift quietly in private thought. New religious movements stir faintly in distant cities. Reformers speak of change. For now, the village hears little of it, but ideas, like trade goods, travel eventually. Let's pause by the manor house again. The Lord's authority remains, but it feels slightly less absolute. Negotiations with tenants are more frequent. Cash payments replace some labor duties. Contracts become more detailed. The manor court still settles disputes over wandering pigs and broken fences, but the tone shifts. Peasants know they are harder to replace. Some lords adapt wisely. Others resist, and tensions grow in certain regions. Peasant revolts flare up in parts of Europe during the late Middle Ages. England in 1381, France in the Jacquerie, Germany later still. Our village might hear about such uprisings months after they occur. The stories arrive softened by distance. Tales of angry crowds, of taxes resisted, of lords confronted. The villagers listen carefully. They weigh the risks. Most prefer stability. Revolution is uncertain. Fields still need tending. And so, life continues in its measured pace. Children born after the plague grow up hearing stories of that terrible time. It becomes part of village memory. Before the Great Sickness and after the Great Sickness become markers in conversation. Generations layer upon one another. Grandparents speak of older feudal customs. Parents navigate a slightly more flexible system. Children imagine lives that might extend beyond the village. Let's drift into one of those children's thoughts. A young boy watches a merchant passing through with a cart full of goods, bright cloth, small metal trinkets. He hears of cities where streets are paved with stone, where buildings rise 3 or 4 stories high, where people from distant lands gather in markets. The idea lingers. Perhaps when he is older, he will leave. And many do. Migration increases slowly in the late medieval period. Not everyone stays bound to their birthplace. Economic opportunity draws people outward. Some villages shrink permanently. Others adapt. Back in our village, the population stabilizes at a smaller number than before the plague. The forest edges forward in places once cleared for farming. Sheep grazing replaces some crop fields in certain regions, especially in England, where wool becomes increasingly profitable. Sheep are quieter than plow teams. Fields once filled with grain sway instead with low white shapes under open sky. Wool travels farther than wheat. It feeds growing textile industries in towns. The village becomes connected to distant markets in a new way. Money circulates more frequently now. Coins clink into leather pouches. Transactions grow slightly more abstract. Less barter, more currency. Still, the hearth remains the center of home life. Evenings look much like they always have. Firelight flickers against rough walls. Stew simmers in familiar pots. Stories pass between generations. But now the stories include more of the outside world, of cities expanding, of kings consolidating power, of distant voyages along unfamiliar coasts. By the late 15th century, whispers of something called new lands begin to circulate in Europe. Ships crossing vast oceans, continents unknown to medieval maps. In the village, these stories feel almost mythical. The ocean itself is unimaginable to many, and yet change is accelerating beyond the fields. Printing presses begin to appear in cities after Gutenberg's innovation in the mid-1400s. Books, once rare and hand-copied, become more accessible. Literacy spreads gradually. Ideas travel faster. It will take time for these developments to reach small rural communities fully, but they will. The Middle Ages do not end with a loud announcement. There is no single morning when the rooster crows and declares, "Congratulations, it is now the Renaissance." Instead, change layers gently atop tradition. The plow remains, the church bell rings, the manor stands, but the context shifts slowly. Kings grow stronger, consolidating territories into more centralized states. Feudal bonds loosen. Standing armies replace temporary levies. In some regions, gunpowder changes warfare. Castles that once symbolized invincibility become vulnerable to cannon fire. Even the architecture of power adapts. Our village notices these changes indirectly. Taxes may shift. Military levies may alter. Lords may build different types of houses. Stone replaces timber more frequently as prosperity grows in certain areas. And yet, for the average villager, daily life remains surprisingly consistent. Wake before dawn, tend the fields, repair tools, prepare meals, attend church, mark births and deaths, watch the seasons turn. The medieval village does not vanish overnight. It evolves, gradually blending into what historians later call the early modern period. If we stand at the edge of the village now, centuries after its founding, we see both continuity and change. The layout is familiar. The church still anchors the center. The fields stretch outward in orderly strips or enclosed plots. But there are more stone houses, slightly larger windows, perhaps even glass panes in more cottages. The world beyond feels closer than it once did. Trade routes extend across continents. Monarchies solidify. Exploration reshapes maps. And still,
In this quiet rural space, a family gathers by the hearth as the sun sets. The rooster will crow again tomorrow. The fields will demand attention. The bell will ring. And life in its steady, repetitive grace continues. The Middle Ages fade not in darkness, but in continuity. The village remains. And long after kings are forgotten and borders redrawn, the rhythm of soil and season carries on, patient, enduring, and quietly eternal.